Sometimes the deepest wounds aren't the ones we can see. Sometimes a man can lose everything that matters and still find a reason to keep breathing when he least expects it. In 1873, Montana, old mountain man Cornelius Ashford had been living alone for 15 years, carrying the grief of his lost family like stones in his chest. He avoided people, avoided hope, avoided anything that might hurt him again. But one October morning, he heard a child crying in the wilderness. A little girl named Robin was trapped under a heavy log. Her wagon crashed, her family nowhere to be found. Cornelius didn't think twice about trying to save her, even when the log crushed his hand and trapped him beside her. As night fell in the mountains, two broken souls found each other in the darkness. What happened next would change them both forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Montana peaks like memories refused to leave an old man's mind. Cornelius Ashford stood on the rough-hewn porch of his cabin, watching the sun paint the wilderness gold, the same way he'd done every morning for 15 years. His weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, steam rising between fingers that had once been gentle enough to braid his daughter's hair and strong enough to build a life from nothing. The cabin sat perched on a rocky outcrop, 2 days' hard ride from the nearest settlement. He'd chosen this place for its isolation, for the way the mountains seemed to swallow sound and sorrow alike. Below the porch, his mule Jasper stood hobbled near a small stream, ears twitching at the morning sounds of the high country. The animal had been his only companion since the fever took everything that mattered. Cornelius had been a different man once. In those days, he'd been the kind of husband who brought his wife Sarah wildflowers just to see her smile. The kind of father who carved wooden toys by lamplight and told bedtime stories that made his children giggle. He'd built furniture with his hands, crafted hope from raw timber, believed in the goodness of tomorrow. The small town of Cedar Falls had known him as a skilled carpenter, a family man, someone you could count on when trouble came calling. Then came the autumn of 1858, when typhoid fever swept through their valley like a dark angel. First little Mary, barely 6 years old, burning with fever that no amount of cool cloths could break. Then young David, 8 and full of dreams about becoming a mountain man himself someday. Sarah fought the longest, holding on as if love alone could anchor her to the world. But even love couldn't stop the fever from taking her too. Cornelius had buried them all beneath the oak tree behind their house, carved their names into stones with the same hands that had once built their marriage bed. After the last shovelful of earth, he'd walked away from everything. The house he'd built board by board. The workshop filled with half-finished projects. The neighbors who offered comfort he couldn't bear to accept. He'd packed his tools, loaded his mule, and headed for the highest, loneliest place he could find. The cabin had taken him 2 months to build, working from dawn to dusk like a man possessed. Every board he split, every stone he laid, was another barrier between himself and the world that had betrayed him. He'd chosen logs from trees that had weathered decades of storms, thinking somehow their endurance might rub off on him. The roof was steep to shed snow, the walls thick enough to keep out more than just the cold. Inside, the cabin held the essentials of solitary survival and little else. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by shelves holding ammunition, preserved food, and a few tools. His bed was narrow, built for one, covered with furs he'd trapped and tanned himself. The table where he ate his meals was rough pine, scarred from years of use. And beside it sat the only chair he'd bothered to make. But hidden in a wooden box beneath his bed lay the things he couldn't bring himself to abandon completely. Sarah's Bible, its leather cover worn smooth from her hands, pressed wildflowers still marking her favorite passages. A lock of Mary's golden hair tied with a ribbon that had once been blue. David's first attempt at whittling, a lopsided horse that the boy had been so proud of. These remnants of love lived in darkness now, too painful to look upon but impossible to discard. The mountains had taught Cornelius the rhythms of survival. He knew where to find the sweetest berries, which streams ran clear through the harshest winters, how to read the sky for storms 3 days away. His trap lines stretched through valleys few men had ever seen, providing the furs that he could trade for coffee, ammunition, and the few supplies he couldn't make or find himself. He'd grown comfortable with silence, had learned to find peace in the sound of wind through pine needles and the distant call of hawks. His conversations were with Jasper, mostly practical discussions about weather and trails, though sometimes he found himself telling the mule stories about the old days, when human voices had filled his world with warmth. The seasons had become his calendar. Spring meant checking trap lines and repairing winter damage to his cabin. Summer brought the work of preservation, smoking meat, gathering plants, preparing for the long months ahead. Autumn was for hunting and laying in the final stores before snow locked the high country away from the world below. Winter was for solitude so complete it sometimes felt like death, but a death that came with morning coffee and the satisfaction of another day survived. Cornelius had convinced himself that this was enough, that a man could live on memories and mountain air, that needing nothing from the world meant the world could never hurt him again. He'd built his isolation like a fortress, stone by stone, season by season, until he could go months without hearing his own voice, except when he spoke to Jasper. But on this particular October morning, as he stood watching the mist clear from the valleys below, something felt different. The air carried a restlessness he couldn't name, a sense that change was moving through the mountains like weather. Jasper seemed to feel it too, lifting his head from the stream to stare down the valley with unusual attention. Cornelius finished his coffee and set the cup on the porch rail. His morning routine called for checking the trap line that ran along Willow Creek, a 2-hour walk through country that had become as familiar as the lines on his own hands. He shouldered his rifle, gathered his pack, and whistled for Jasper. The mule fell into step behind him as they took the trail that wound down from the cabin toward the creek bottom. The path was one Cornelius had worn himself over the years, marked by blazes he'd cut into trees and cairns of stones he'd built at confusing turns. This morning he walked it without conscious thought, his feet finding each familiar step while his mind wandered to practical concerns. The first snow would come soon. He could smell it in the air, and there were still preparations to make. As they descended into the valley, the forest grew thicker, aspens giving way to pine and fir. The trail crossed the creek 3 times, each ford marked by flat stones Cornelius had placed for easier crossing. The water ran clear and cold, speaking in the liquid language that was the closest thing to human conversation he'd heard in months. It was here, as he paused to let Jasper drink from the stream, that Cornelius first heard the sound that would change everything. Faint and distant, carried on the mountain breeze, came something that stopped his heart cold, the desperate, terrified crying of a child. For a moment he stood frozen, wondering if loneliness had finally driven him mad. But Jasper's ears were up too, and the mule was staring downstream with the alertness of an animal that knows something is very wrong. The crying came again, weaker now, but unmistakably real. Cornelius felt something crack inside his chest, like ice breaking up in a spring thaw. After 15 years of carefully maintained indifference to human suffering, he found his feet moving toward that desperate sound, carrying him away from his safe, solitary world and toward whatever trouble waited in the wilderness ahead. The crying grew stronger as Cornelius pushed through the undergrowth, following the sound like a man following his own heartbeat. Jasper stayed close behind, the mule's usual stubbornness replaced by an animal awareness that something was badly wrong. The trail here was little more than a game path, winding through stands of aspen whose leaves whispered secrets in the autumn breeze. When he finally broke through the tree line, Cornelius stopped so suddenly that Jasper nearly walked into him. Before them lay the wreckage of what had once been a family's hopes for a new life. A wagon lay overturned in a small clearing, its contents scattered like broken dreams across the forest floor. One wheel spun slowly in the breeze, creaking with each revolution. The team of horses was nowhere to be seen, likely spooked and long gone into the wilderness, but it was the sound that drew his attention most powerfully. There, pinned beneath a massive pine log that had fallen across the wagon's path, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, her small frame trapped beneath the crushing weight of timber that would challenge 3 strong men to move. Her dress, once probably blue, was torn and dirty. A ribbon that might have been bright once hung loose from her tangled brown hair. Near the wagon, 2 adults lay motionless on the ground. The man, probably her father, was unconscious with blood matting his dark hair. The woman, her mother, Cornelius assumed, lay unnaturally still, her breathing so shallow it was barely visible. They'd been thrown clear when the wagon overturned, but neither showed any sign of waking. "Help me," the little girl called out when she saw him, her voice hoarse from crying. "Please, mister, help me. I can't move my leg." For 15 years, Cornelius had avoided situations exactly like this one. He'd built his life around never again caring whether another human being lived or died, never again investing his heart in someone who could be taken away. But looking down at this child, trapped and terrified and calling for help with eyes that held too much fear for someone so young, he felt every wall he'd built crumble like sand. "Easy now," he said, his voice rusty from disuse, but gentle in a way he'd almost forgotten. "I'm here. What's your name, little one?" "Robin," she whispered, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked cheeks. "My name's Robin. Are Mama and Papa going to be all right?" Cornelius glanced at the unconscious adults, then back at the child. He couldn't tell her what he suspected, that her parents were hurt worse than anyone should be and still draw breath. Instead, he knelt beside the log, examining the situation with the practical eye of a man who'd spent decades solving problems with his hands. The pine was enormous, easily 3 feet in diameter and heavy with the weight of years. It had fallen at an angle, one end resting on a boulder, the other pinning Robin's left leg to the ground. She was conscious and talking, which was encouraging, but he could see the unnatural angle of her trapped limb. "I'm going to get you out of there," he told her, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. "My name's Cornelius. I live up in these mountains, and I know how to move heavy things." Robin's eyes, wide with pain and fear, fixed on his face with the desperate trust that children give to adults who promise to make everything better. "It hurts real bad, Mr. Cornelius." "I know it does, child. But you're brave, aren't you? I can tell just by looking at you that you're one of the brave ones." He began examining the log more carefully, looking for leverage points and calculating angles. The boulder providing the fulcrum was well positioned, but he'd need something to use as a lever long and strong enough to lift the massive timber. His eyes fell on a broken wagon tongue, oak seasoned hard by years of use. "Robin, I need you to listen to me very carefully," he said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "I'm going to try to lift this log off your leg. When I do, you might feel some pain, but then you'll be free. Can you be brave for just a little bit longer?" She nodded, biting her lip to keep from crying out. In that gesture, Cornelius saw an echo of his own Mary's determination, the way she'd faced her fever with a courage that shamed grown men. He positioned the wagon tongue against the boulder, wedging one end beneath the log as close to Robin as he dared. The physics were simple enough. Lever and fulcrum, the same principles that had helped him move stones when building his cabin. But the weight was enormous, and he wasn't the young man who'd once lifted roof beams single-handed. "On the count of 3, he told her. 1. Cornelius threw his full weight against the makeshift lever. For a moment, nothing happened. The log seemed as immovable as the mountains themselves. Then slowly, incredibly, it began to rise. An inch, then 2, then enough space for a small girl to pull her leg free. "Now, Robin, pull yourself out." But as she tried to move, the wagon tongue cracked with a sound like a gunshot. The log, released from its tenuous hold, crashed back down, but not before Cornelius, in a desperate lunge to catch the falling timber, managed to get his own hand beneath it. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. He felt bones crack like kindling, felt his hand crushed between the log and the hard earth. His vision went white for a moment, and he nearly blacked out from the shock of it. When the world came back into focus, he found himself lying beside Robin, his right hand pinned beneath the same log that trapped her leg. Blood seeped through his fingers where the bark had torn the skin. The pain was so intense he could barely think, but through it all he heard Robin's voice. "Mr. Cornelius. Mr. Cornelius, are you hurt?" He tried to move his hand and nearly screamed. The log had settled deeper into the soft earth, and now both of them were trapped. Night was coming. He could see it in the way the light slanted through the trees, and with it would come the cold that killed more people in these mountains than bears or wolves ever had. "I'm all right, child," he managed to say, though speaking took more effort than he'd expected. "Just got myself into the same predicament as you, that's all." Robin reached out with her small hand and touched his arm. "I'm scared." Mr. Cornelius, looking at her, this brave little girl who'd been through more terror in one day than most children faced in a lifetime. Cornelius felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. He felt needed, not just wanted or missed, but actually necessary for someone else's survival. It was terrifying and wonderful at the same time. "I know you are," he said softly, "but we're going to take care of each other now." Sometimes that's how it works. People get stuck together and they help each other until help comes. Will help come. Cornelius looked at the unconscious parents, at the isolated clearing, miles from any traveled road, at the approaching darkness. He should have told her the truth, that they were on their own, that no one knew where they were, that survival would depend entirely on their own resources and a fair amount of luck. Instead, he found himself saying, "Help always comes to people who don't give up hope." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above the clearing, Cornelius realized that in trying to save this child, he might have doomed them both. But strangely, for the first time in 15 years, he didn't regret taking the risk. Love, it seemed, was like a muscle. It got weak from disuse, but it never entirely forgot how to work. He just hoped it would be strong enough to get them through whatever was coming. Night came to the mountains like a curtain, dropping swift and absolute. The temperature began its relentless fall, and Cornelius knew that without shelter they wouldn't survive until morning. His crushed hand throbbed with every heartbeat, but he forced himself to think through their situation with the methodical clarity that had kept him alive in the wilderness for 15 years. "Robin," he said, keeping his voice steady despite the pain, "I need you to help me with something important. Can you do that?" The little girl nodded, though he could see the fear in her eyes as darkness gathered around them. "What do you need me to do, Mr. Cornelius?" "I need you to reach into my coat pocket, the left one, and pull out my knife. It's got a bone handle and it's very sharp, so be careful with it." Robin stretched as far as she could with her leg pinned, her small fingers finding the knife and drawing it out carefully. The blade gleamed dully in the starlight, its edge honed to razor sharpness from years of use. Cornelius had carved that handle himself, from the antler of the first elk he'd taken in these mountains, and the knife had been his constant companion ever since. "Good girl. Now, do you see those canvas pieces scattered around from your wagon? We need to gather up as many as we can reach. We're going to make ourselves a shelter." Working with one hand while pinned beneath the log was awkward and painful. But Cornelius managed to direct Robin in collecting pieces of canvas, torn clothing, and anything else that might provide insulation. The girl showed remarkable composure for someone so young, following his instructions without complaint. Despite her own pain and the growing cold, "My papa always said I was good at following directions," she said, as she dragged a piece of canvas close to where they lay trapped. "He said it was because I paid attention. Your papa sounds like a wise man," Cornelius replied, though he glanced worriedly at the motionless form of her father. The man's breathing was shallow and irregular, and in the growing darkness, Cornelius couldn't tell if he was getting better or worse. Using the knife and Robin's small hands, they managed to create a rough lean-to against the side of the overturned wagon. It wasn't much, just canvas and fabric arranged to block the worst of the wind, but it would trap their body heat and might make the difference between life and death before morning. "Are you hungry?" Cornelius asked, remembering the jerky in his pack. The pack had been thrown clear when he'd lunged for the log, but it was just within reach if he stretched. A little. Robin admitted. "We were going to stop for supper when we found a good place to camp. Mumba was going to make johnny cakes. Cornelius retrieved a piece of dried meat from his pack and handed it to him. This isn't as good as johnny cakes, but it'll keep you strong. Chew it slow, it's tough, but it's got good flavor." As Robin gnawed on the jerky, Cornelius studied their situation more carefully. His hand was trapped, but not as severely as her leg. The log rested across his knuckles and wrist, crushing but not completely cutting off circulation. He could feel his fingers, though they were growing numb from the pressure and cold. Robin's situation was more serious. Her leg was pinned at mid-calf, and from what he could see in the dim light, it was likely broken. She was being brave about it, but he could tell from the way she held herself that the pain was constant and severe. "Robin, tell me about your family," he said, partly to distract her from the cold and pain, and partly because he needed to know more about their situation. "Where were you headed?" "We were going to Oregon," she said, her voice small in the darkness. "Papa heard there was good land there, and Mama wanted to be near her sister. We've been traveling for weeks and weeks." "Just the three of you?" Robin nodded. "Papa said it was better to travel light and fast. He said too many people in a wagon train just meant more trouble." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "He always carried Mama's locket." "Said it was good luck." Cornelius had noticed the locket earlier, clutched in Robin's small fist. It was gold, probably the most valuable thing the family owned, with a delicate chain that caught what little light filtered through their makeshift shelter. "Can I see it?" he asked gently. Robin opened her palm, revealing the locket. Even in the darkness, Cornelius could see it was finely made, with intricate engraving around the edges. "Mama gave it to me when she saw the log falling. She said to keep it safe. May I?" When Robin nodded, Cornelius carefully opened the locket with his good hand. Inside was a small daguerreotype, a family portrait showing a younger version of Robin with her parents. They looked happy and hopeful, dressed in their best clothes for the photograph. "That was taken before we left home," Robin said softly. "Papa said we needed a picture to remember what we looked like when we started our adventure." The word adventure struck Cornelius like a physical blow. This child still saw their journey as an adventure, despite being trapped and hurt and alone in the wilderness. Her innocence and resilience reminded him so powerfully of his own children that he had to close his eyes for a moment. "It's a beautiful picture," he said, handing the locket back to her. "Your family looks very happy." "We were," Robin said simply. "Papa always made us laugh, and Mummy sang the prettiest songs." She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Mr. Cornelius, do you have a family?" The question hit him harder than the falling log had. For 15 years, he'd avoided thinking about his family as anything but a source of pain, memories to be buried and forgotten. But lying here beside this injured child, he found himself remembering not just the grief, but the joy that had come before it. "I did once," he said finally. "I had a wife named Sarah and 2 children, Mary and David. They died a long time ago from a sickness." "I'm sorry," Robin said with the solemn sincerity that children bring to matters of life and death. "Do you miss them?" "Every day," Cornelius admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "Maybe they're watching over us tonight," Robin suggested. "Mama always said that people who love us don't really leave us alone." From his pack, Cornelius pulled out the heavy wool blanket he always carried. It smelled of wood smoke and mountain air, but it was warm and dry. Carefully he wrapped it around both of them, creating a cocoon of shared body heat beneath their improvised shelter. "Try to sleep if you can," he told her. "Morning will come, and with it new possibilities." But as Robin's breathing gradually slowed and deepened, Cornelius remained awake, listening to the night sounds of the mountains. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the sound was answered by others. Closer by, an owl hooted from the darkness beyond their shelter. His hand throbbed steadily, and he could feel swelling that meant the damage was significant. But worse than the physical pain was the growing realization of their situation. They were miles from any settlement, on a route that saw little travel. Robin's parents showed no signs of regaining consciousness, and even if they did, both appeared badly injured. The smart thing, the thing the hermit he'd become would do, would be to find a way to free himself and leave. He could probably work his way out from under the log, might even be able to fashion a splint for his hand. He could make it back to his cabin, survive whatever was coming, but looking at Robin's sleeping face in the starlight, peaceful despite everything she'd endured, Cornelius knew he couldn't leave her. 15 years of carefully constructed indifference crumbled in the face of one simple truth. This child needed him, and that need had awakened something in him that he'd thought was dead forever. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Dawn crept into the clearing like hope, returning to a broken heart, slowly, tentatively, but undeniably real. Cornelius woke to find Robin already stirring beside him, her small hand still clutching the wooden doll she'd managed to retrieve from the scattered wagon contents during the night. The doll was roughly carved but lovingly crafted, showing the kind of patient work that spoke of a father's devotion. "Good morning, Mr. Cornelius," Robin said softly, her voice stronger than it had been the night before. "I dreamed about my papa making this doll. He worked on it every evening after we made camp, whittling by the firelight." Cornelius studied the doll in the pale morning light. It was simple but skillfully made, carved from what looked like pine and smoothed to a satin finish. The face had been painted with careful detail, blue eyes, rosy cheeks, and a gentle smile. Despite everything the doll had been through in the wagon crash, it remained intact, a testament to the love that had shaped it. "Your papa's a fine craftsman," Cornelius said, though he glanced worriedly at Robin's father, who remained unconscious. The man's breathing seemed shallower than the night before, and his skin had taken on an unhealthy pallor. "He always said that anything worth making was worth making right," Robin replied, holding the doll against her chest. "He spent weeks on this, said it had to be perfect for his little girl." The devotion in her voice reminded Cornelius of his own children, of the toys he'd carved for them during long winter evenings. David's wooden horse, Mary's miniature furniture for her own doll, each piece crafted with the same loving attention that Robin's father had put into this simple figure. "What's your doll's name?" he asked, settling back against the makeshift shelter. His hand felt worse this morning, swollen and hot to the touch, but he pushed the concern aside. They had more immediate problems to solve. "Constance," Robin said, stroking the doll's wooden hair. "Mama said it meant steadfast, like how she'd always be with me no matter what happened." Her voice caught slightly on the words, and Cornelius saw tears gathering in her eyes. "That's a fine name for a fine doll," he said gently. "And your mama was right. Some kinds of love do stay with us no matter what." Robin looked up at him with those grave, too-old eyes that children get when life forces them to grow up too quickly. "Do you think Mama and Papa are going to wake up today?" Cornelius had been dreading this question. In the growing daylight, he could see that Robin's mother hadn't moved at all since yesterday, her chest barely rising and falling. Her husband showed more signs of life, occasionally muttering in his unconscious state, but his injuries looked severe. "I don't know, child," he said honestly, "but I know they'd want us to take care of each other while we wait and see." Robin nodded solemnly, then surprised him by trying to sit up straighter. "Then we should have breakfast and figure out what to do next." That's what Papa would say. Her resilience amazed him. Despite being trapped and injured, despite watching her parents lie unconscious, she was ready to face the day, with determination that would shame many grown men. It reminded him of something Sarah used to say, that children were closer to God than adults, because they hadn't learned to doubt that tomorrow could be better than today. Cornelius shared more of his jerky and some water from his canteen, watching Robin eat with the careful precision of a child who'd been taught not to waste food. As she ate, she told him stories about their journey west, about the rivers they'd crossed and the towns they'd passed through, about her parents' dreams of the farm they'd built in Oregon. "Papa said the soil there was so rich you could grow anything," she said, eyes bright with inherited dreams. "And Mama wanted to plant fruit trees, apple and pear, maybe some cherry trees for pies." "That sounds like a fine place to build a life," Cornelius said, though privately he wondered if those dreams would ever see fulfillment. As the morning progressed, he began teaching Robin basic survival skills, partly to keep her mind occupied, and partly because he was beginning to face the possibility that she might need to survive on her own. He showed her how to identify edible plants, how to find clean water, how to read the sky for weather changes. The important thing, he told her, is to stay calm and think things through. Panic is what kills people in the wilderness, not the cold or the wild animals. Robin listened with the intense concentration of a good student, asking thoughtful questions and repeating back the key points to make sure she understood. Her intelligence was obvious, but more than that, she had the kind of practical wisdom that would serve her well if the worst happened. "You're a good teacher." "Mr. Cornelius," she said during a break in the lesson, "did you teach your own children about the mountains?" "I was planning to," he admitted. David especially was fascinated by the idea of living in the wilderness. He used to make me tell him stories about mountain men and trappers. The memory came without the usual stab of pain, softened somehow by sharing it with this brave little girl. "Tell me one of those stories," Robin requested, settling back with Constance in her arms. So Cornelius found himself telling tales he hadn't spoken aloud in 15 years. Stories of legendary mountain men like Hugh Glass and Jim Bridger, of adventures in uncharted territories and encounters with grizzly bears. Robin listened with rapt attention, her eyes wide with wonder at these tales of courage and survival. "Were those men ever scared?" she asked when he finished one particularly harrowing story. "Oh yes," Cornelius said. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what needs doing, even when you are scared, like you did yesterday trying to save me." The question caught him off guard. He hadn't thought of his actions as particularly brave, just necessary. But looking at it through Robin's eyes, he supposed it did take courage to risk everything for someone else, especially for someone who'd spent 15 years avoiding such risks. "Like you're doing right now," he said instead. "Being trapped and hurt and still taking care of your doll, still thinking about tomorrow, that's the bravest thing I've seen in a long while." Robin smiled at that. The first real smile he'd seen from her since the accident. It transformed her face, showing him the happy child she'd been before tragedy struck. In that smile, he saw echoes of his own Mary's joy, but also something uniquely Robin's, a resilience and strength that spoke of a spirit that wouldn't be easily broken. As the day warmed, they continued their survival lessons and storytelling, creating a strange kind of normalcy in their desperate situation. Cornelius found himself remembering not just the pain of losing his children, but the joy of being their father, the satisfaction of teaching them, the pride in watching them learn and grow. Robin, for her part, seemed to find comfort in having an adult's attention and care. She began opening up more about her fears and hopes, her memories of the journey west, her dreams of the new life her family had been seeking. But as the afternoon wore on, both of Robin's parents remained unconscious, and Cornelius couldn't ignore the growing probability that help wasn't coming. They were on their own, an injured old man and a trapped child, with winter approaching and no one in the world knowing where they were. Yet somehow, in the warmth of this strange new friendship, the situation felt less hopeless than it should have. They had each other now, and that seemed like more than either of them had possessed the day before. The second day brought a fever that crept through Cornelius's body like wildfire through dry timber. His crushed hand had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, the skin tight and angry red where infection was setting in. He tried to hide the worst of it from Robin, but children have a way of seeing through adult pretenses, especially when survival depends on honesty. "You're burning up, Mr. Cornelius," Robin said, pressing her small palm against his forehead with the matter-of-fact concern of someone far older than her years. "Mama always checked for fever like this when I was sick. Just a bit under the weather," he mumbled, though speaking took more effort than it should have. The world kept sliding in and out of focus, and he found himself struggling to remember where they were and why Robin was there beside him. Robin had managed to reach some of her family's scattered belongings during the morning, including a water bottle and some clean cloth that she was now using to make compresses for his forehead. Her movements were careful and deliberate, showing the kind of competence that comes from watching adults handle crises. "Tell me about your children again," she said as she worked. "The stories help when you're hurting." In his fevered state, the memories came more easily, less guarded by the protective walls he'd built around them. He told Robin about Mary's laugh, bright as silver bells, and how she used to make mud pies in their garden that she'd pretend were real cakes for elaborate tea parties. He described David's fascination with everything mechanical, how the boy could take apart and reassemble his father's tools with an engineer's precision. "Mary sounds like me," Robin said with a small smile. "I love tea parties too. And David sounds smart like Papa. He can fix anything." As the afternoon wore on, Cornelius's fever climbed higher and his grip on reality became increasingly tenuous. Sometimes, when he looked at Robin, he saw Mary instead, her golden hair catching the light as she played with her wooden toys. Other times, he was convinced David was there too, asking endless questions about how things worked. "Papa?" he called out during one particularly bad spell, reaching toward Robin with his good hand. "Papa, the horses got loose again." "I'm Robin, Mr. Cornelius," she said gently, taking his hand in both of hers. "You're sick, but I'm taking care of you now." But even as she corrected him, she didn't pull away. Instead, she seemed to understand instinctively that in his delirium he needed the comfort of believing his children were near. She played along when he called her Mary, answering to the name with the natural grace of a child who understood that sometimes truth was less important than kindness. During his more lucid moments, Cornelius tried to prepare Robin for the possibility that he might not recover. He taught her how to fashion a tourniquet from strips of cloth, how to start a fire with flint and steel, how to identify the North Star for navigation. Each lesson was interrupted by waves of fever, but Robin absorbed every word with the desperate attention of someone who might soon depend entirely on herself. "If something happens to me," he said during one clear spell, "you head downstream along the creek. Follow it down the mountain until you find people. Don't try to go back up, always go down when you're lost. You're not going to leave me," Robin said firmly. Her jaw set with determination that reminded him of Sarah when she'd made up her mind about something. "I won't let you." As evening approached, the fever reached its peak. Cornelius tossed restlessly beneath their shared blanket, muttering names and fragments of conversations from 15 years past. In his delirium, the boundaries between past and present dissolved completely. He was building a cradle for Mary's doll, teaching David to whittle, dancing with Sarah in their kitchen while snow fell outside their windows. It was during one of these fevered episodes that he felt around in his coat pocket and pulled out something he hadn't looked at in years, a daguerreotype of his own family, taken shortly before the fever claimed them. The photograph was bent and faded, the metal plate tarnished, but the faces were still clear enough to recognize. Robin leaned over to look at the picture, her eyes widening as she took in the formal poses and serious expressions that were common in photographs of that era. "Is that them? Your family?" "That's them," Cornelius whispered, his fever momentarily breaking as he stared at the faces he'd tried so hard to forget. "That's Sarah and Mary and David. We had this taken just before—" His voice caught, and he couldn't finish the sentence. "They look happy," Robin said softly. "Even though they're not smiling, you can see it in their eyes." She was right. Despite the formal nature of the portrait, there was something unmistakably joyful about the family captured in that moment. The way Sarah's hand rested on his shoulder, the way the children leaned slightly toward their parents, the sense of belonging that radiated from the group even through the aged metal and faded chemistry. "I used to look at this every day," Cornelius admitted. "Then it hurt too much, so I put it away. Haven't taken it out in years. Maybe it doesn't have to hurt so much anymore," Robin suggested, with the simple wisdom that children sometimes possess. "Maybe looking at happy pictures can make you remember the happiness instead of just the sadness." as if to prove her point. She pulled out her mother's locket again, opening it to reveal her own family's photograph. When I look at this, I remember Papa singing while we travelled, and Mama braiding my hair every morning. The sad parts are there too, but the good parts are stronger. Cornelius studied the two photographs side by side, his family from 15 years ago, Robin's from just a few months past. Both captured moments of love and hope, frozen instants when the future seemed bright and full of promise. Both families had been torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. Yet somehow, looking at the pictures together with Robin, the overwhelming emotion wasn't grief, but gratitude for the love that had existed at all. "You're a wise child," he told her, his fever making his voice sound distant and strange. "Wiser than this old man has been for a long time." As night fell and his temperature climbed even higher, Cornelius found himself drifting between worlds. Sometimes he was back in Cedar Falls, working in his shop, while Sarah hummed in the kitchen. Sometimes he was here in the clearing with Robin, trying to fight off an infection that could kill them both. And sometimes he was in some strange place between the two, where past and present mingled, and all the people he'd ever loved were somehow present and real. Through it all, Robin stayed beside him, wiping his fevered brow with cool water, talking to him in soothing tones, keeping him anchored to the world of the living through the simple power of her presence. She told him stories about her journey west, sang lullabies her mother had taught her, and shared memories of her father's gentle hands and patient ways. In his delirium, Cornelius sometimes forgot which child was real and which was memory, but it no longer mattered. Love was love, whether it came from the past or the present, whether it belonged to children lost or children found. For the first time in 15 years, he allowed himself to feel that love fully, without the protective barriers of grief and guilt, and somehow, in accepting that love again, he found the strength to keep fighting the fever that threatened to take him away from this brave little girl who needed him so desperately. Dawn of the third day broke grey and cold, with the promise of worse weather ahead. Cornelius woke to find his fever had broken sometime during the night, leaving him weak but clear-headed for the first time since the infection had taken hold. Robin was curled against his side, still clutching her father's brass compass, a beautiful instrument with intricate engravings that caught what little light filtered through their makeshift shelter. "You found your papa's compass," he observed, his voice hoarse but steady. Robin stirred, then sat up quickly when she realized he was lucid. "Mr. Cornelius, your fever's gone." She pressed her palm to his forehead, her face lighting up with relief. "I was so scared you were going to leave me too." The compass in her hands was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, its brass case worn smooth from years of handling. The face was ivory-colored with black numerals, and the needle swung true, despite everything it had been through in the wagon crash. When Robin opened the case, Cornelius could see an inscription engraved on the inside lid. "To my dearest Frank, may you always find your way home. Mary Ellen, 1869. Papa always carried this," Robin said, holding it reverently. He said it belonged to his grandfather, who was a ship's captain. Papa used it to navigate when we traveled, always checking to make sure we were heading the right direction. Cornelius took the compass gently, studying its construction with the appreciation of a craftsman. The weight was perfect, balanced and solid, and the mechanism moved with the precision that only came from the finest clockwork. This was a tool made by masters, built to last generations. "Your great-grandfather must have been quite a man," he said, handing it back to her. "Ship captains need to know exactly where they are at all times. One wrong turn in the ocean, and you're lost forever." "Papa always said the compass would help us find our way to anywhere we wanted to go," Robin replied. Then her voice grew smaller. "But what good is knowing which direction to go if you can't move?" It was a fair question, and one that had been weighing on Cornelius's mind since the fever cleared. His infection seemed to have stabilized, but his hand remained trapped and increasingly damaged. Robin's leg showed no improvement either, and her parents remained unconscious, their breathing growing shallower with each passing hour. "Let me see that compass again," he said, studying the instrument more carefully. Point it toward that gap in the trees there." Robin did as he asked, and Cornelius noted the reading. "Northeast," he said thoughtfully. "If we follow that bearing down the mountain, staying with the creek, we should hit the main trail to Helena in about 15 miles, but we can't follow anything," Robin pointed out with the practical logic of a child. "We're stuck." "Maybe not forever," Cornelius said, though he kept his voice carefully neutral. An idea had been forming in his mind since he'd awakened, a desperate plan that might free one of them at least. "Robin, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Your papa's compass is going to be the most important thing you own." Something in his tone made her look at him sharply. "What are you thinking, Mr. Cornelius?" Before he could answer, a sound from across the clearing caught their attention. Robin's mother was moving, not much, just a slight shifting of her position, but it was the first sign of consciousness they'd seen from either parent since the accident. "Mama!" Robin called out, straining against the log that held her trapped. "Mama, can you hear me?" The woman's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused, but undeniably aware. She tried to speak, but only managed a weak whisper that they couldn't understand from across the clearing. "She's waking up," Robin said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mr. Cornelius, Mama's waking up." But even as they watched hopefully, Robin's mother's eyes closed again, and she slipped back into unconsciousness. The brief moment of awareness had been encouraging, but it also highlighted how badly injured she was, how far from recovery. "At least we know she's still fighting," Cornelius said gently. "Sometimes that's all we can ask for." Throughout the morning, he began teaching Robin more advanced navigation skills, showing her how to use the compass in conjunction with natural landmarks, how to estimate distances and travel time, how to find water and shelter along an unfamiliar route. She absorbed every lesson with the focused attention of someone who sensed these skills might soon become vital. "The most important thing," he emphasized, "is to stay calm and think things through. This compass will tell you which way to go, but you have to use your head about how to get there safely." "Why are you teaching me all this?" Robin asked during a break in the lessons. "You're not planning to leave me, are you?" Cornelius chose his words carefully. "I'm teaching you because knowledge is the best gift an adult can give a child. Whether we travel together or apart, you'll need these skills to survive in this country." As the day progressed, storm clouds began building over the mountains, promising the first real weather they'd faced since being trapped. The wind picked up, sending leaves swirling through the clearing and bringing the sharp scent of snow on the air. "Winter's coming early this year," Cornelius observed, watching the sky with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades reading mountain weather. "We might see snow before morning. Will we be all right?" Robin asked, though her question carried deeper implications than just concern about the weather. "We'll face whatever comes," Cornelius replied. "That's what people do when they care about each other. They face things together." But privately, he knew their situation was becoming desperate. His hand was showing signs of serious infection, despite the fever breaking, and Robin's leg needed medical attention that was days away at best. The approaching storm would make travel impossible even if they could free themselves. And winter in the high country was no place for an injured old man and a child. As evening approached and the first snowflakes began to fall, Cornelius made a decision that had been building in his mind all day. Looking at Robin, brave and trusting beside him, he realized that love sometimes meant being willing to make the hardest choice of all. "Robin," he said quietly, "I need you to promise me something." "What is it, Mr. Cornelius?" "I need you to promise that no matter what happens, you'll use that compass to find your way to safety. Can you do that for me?" Robin studied his face with those two wise eyes, seeing something there that made her voice tremble when she answered. "Only if you promise not to give up on us." "I promise I'll do everything I can to take care of you," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. As snow began to accumulate on their shelter and the wind howled through the trees, Cornelius held Robin close and told her stories of brave explorers who used compasses and stars to find their way through impossible journeys. But in his heart, he was already planning for a morning when she might have to make such a journey herself. The storm hit with mountain fury, driving snow through every gap in their shelter and turning their small refuge into a barely adequate windbreak. Cornelius held Robin close as the wind howled around them, feeling her small body shiver despite the blankets they'd wrapped around themselves. But it was the cold that drove Robin to make the discovery that would change everything. "I can't feel my feet, Mr. Cornelius," she whispered through chattering teeth. "Maybe there's something warmer in the wagon we missed." "Stay close to me," he said, though they both knew their current shelter wouldn't survive much more of the storm's assault. "Let's see what we can find." Working together, they managed to pull more debris from the overturned wagon toward their position. It was then, while searching through a scattered pile of their belongings, that Robin's numb fingers found something that shouldn't have been there. A hidden compartment built into the wagon's floor, partially concealed by canvas and supplies. "Mr. Cornelius, there's something strange here," she said, her voice puzzled. "Papa built this wagon himself, but I never knew about this hiding place." Cornelius felt around the edges of what Robin had discovered, his good hand tracing the outline of a carefully concealed compartment. The craftsmanship was excellent, so well done that it would be invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Whatever was hidden there, Robin's father had gone to considerable trouble to keep it secret. "Can you get it open?" he asked, though a growing sense of unease was settling in his stomach. Robin's small fingers found the hidden latch, and the compartment swung open with a soft click. What they found inside made them both fall silent with shock. There were stacks of paper money, more cash than most families would see in years, along with several official-looking documents and what appeared to be wanted posters. With trembling hands, Robin pulled out one of the papers, unfolding it in the dim light of their shelter. Even in the storm's gloom, the bold letters at the top were unmistakable: "Wanted, dead or alive." Below the text was a detailed sketch that looked remarkably like Robin's father, though the name printed beneath read Frank Morrison, armed robbery. "Murder, bank theft. That's Papa," Robin whispered, her voice so small it was almost lost in the wind. "But it says terrible things about him." Cornelius took the poster with his good hand, studying it more carefully. The resemblance was undeniable, and the description matched perfectly. Height approximately 5'10", brown hair, scar above left eyebrow, known to travel with wife and young daughter. The reward offered was substantial, $500, enough to make any bounty hunter's year. There were other posters too, each one documenting different crimes attributed to Frank Morrison and his gang. Bank robberies in Colorado, a stagecoach holdup in Wyoming, even a murder in Kansas that had left 2 men dead. According to the dates on the posters, the crimes stretched back over 3 years. "I don't understand," Robin said, tears mixing with the snow on her cheeks. "Papa's not a bad man. He reads me stories and teaches me about the stars and fixes broken things. He wouldn't hurt anybody." But even as she spoke, other pieces of the puzzle were falling into place for Cornelius. The isolated route they'd been traveling, avoiding main roads and settlements. The fact that no one would be looking for them, because Frank Morrison couldn't risk the attention that a search party would bring. The quality equipment and supplies that should have been beyond the means of an ordinary farming family. Robin continued searching through the compartment, finding more evidence that painted an increasingly dark picture of her father's activities. There were maps marked with routes between banks and mining towns, detailed notes about guard schedules and vault locations, even sketches of building layouts that could only have been drawn by someone planning criminal activities. "There's something else," Robin said quietly, pulling out a letter written in her father's distinctive handwriting. She handed it to Cornelius, unable to read it herself in the poor light. The letter was addressed to someone named Cole, and its contents made Cornelius's blood run cold. Frank Morrison was writing to arrange a final job, something big enough to set his family up for life in Oregon, where they could disappear forever. But the job had gone wrong, the letter explained, and now they were running from both the law and Morrison's former partners. who blamed him for the botched robbery that had left several of their gang dead or captured. What does it say? Robin asked, seeing the expression on Cornelius's face. Cornelius folded the letter carefully, his mind racing through the implications of what they'd discovered. It says your papa was in some kind of trouble, and that's why you were traveling alone instead of with a wagon train. But there was more. Documents that revealed Frank Morrison's real identity, photographs of the gang members, and most damning of all, a list of their victims. Names and dates that represented real people whose lives had been destroyed by the crimes Robin's father had committed. "He's not my papa's real name, is he?" Robin asked with the terrible clarity that children sometimes possess. "Frank Morrison, that's not who he really is." "No," Cornelius said gently. "I think your papa chose that name to hide from people who were looking for him." Robin was quiet for a long moment, staring at the wanted poster that bore her father's face. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the tears. "Does this mean the good things about him weren't real either? The stories and the laughter and the way he used to sing while we traveled?" "No, child," Cornelius said firmly. "People can do bad things and still love their families. What he did to other people was wrong, but the way he loved you and your mama, that was real." The storm continued to rage around them, but inside their shelter, a different kind of tempest was building. Robin clutched her father's compass, the same instrument that had guided him to banks and stagecoaches, and ultimately to this remote trail where his past had finally caught up with him. "Are people going to come looking for us?" she asked. "Not the kind of people we'd want to find us," Cornelius admitted. "According to these papers, there are bounty hunters, and maybe worse, tracking your papa. They won't care that you're just a child." Robin absorbed this information with the stoic acceptance of someone who'd already endured more than her share of tragedy. "Then we really are on our own, aren't we?" "Yes," Cornelius said, "but that doesn't change anything between us. You're still the brave little girl who's been taking care of me. And I'm still going to do everything I can to keep you safe." As the snow continued to fall and the wind howled through the mountains, they sat together in the wreckage of everything Robin had believed about her family. But somehow, in the midst of that devastation, the bond between them grew stronger rather than weaker. They were outcasts now, an old hermit and the daughter of a notorious criminal, but they had each other, and sometimes in the wild country where they found themselves, that had to be enough. The fourth day dawned clear but bitter cold, the storm having blown itself out during the night and leaving behind a world transformed by snow and ice. Cornelius woke to find his infected hand had worsened dramatically. The flesh was now an angry purple-black, and he could feel the poison spreading up his arm like liquid fire. He knew he was dying, and more importantly, he knew he was running out of time to save Robin, but it was the sound that came. From across the clearing that changed everything, a weak cough, followed by words spoken in a voice, hoarse from injury and unconsciousness. "Robin? Robin, baby, where are you?" Robin's father had finally awakened. "Papa!" Robin cried out, straining against the log that held her trapped. "Papa, I'm here!" "I'm trapped, but I'm all right." Frank Morrison, or whatever his real name might be, struggled to sit up, his movements slow and painful. Blood had crusted in his hair, and one arm hung at an unnatural angle, but his eyes were clear and focused on his daughter with desperate love. "Thank God," he whispered. "I thought when I saw the wagon—" His voice broke as he took in the full scope of their situation. "How long have we been here?" 4 days, Papa. This is Mr. Cornelius. He tried to save me, but he got trapped too." Frank's eyes found Cornelius, taking in the older man's condition with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating threats and allies. "You stayed with her," he said simply. "Thank you. Any decent man would have done the same," Cornelius replied, though the effort of speaking was becoming more difficult as the infection progressed. Frank tried to stand, but collapsed back to the ground with a grunt of pain. "My leg's busted," he said through gritted teeth. "Maybe some ribs, too." He looked toward where his wife lay motionless. "Mary Ellen, is she—" "She woke up yesterday for a minute," Robin said quickly. "But she's been sleeping since then." Frank's face crumpled as he looked at his unconscious wife, and for a moment he was just a husband, terrified of losing the woman he loved, rather than the notorious outlaw described on the wanted posters. "This is all my fault," he whispered. "I brought this on us." It was then that Robin, with the heartbreaking honesty that children possess, said, "Papa, we found the hiding place in the wagon." Frank went very still. "What did you find?" "The papers," Robin said quietly. "The ones that say you're Frank Morrison." The silence that followed was heavy, with 15 years' worth of lies unraveling. Frank closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were filled with a pain that went deeper than any physical injury. "I never wanted you to know about that," he said finally. "I was trying to build us a new life, somewhere we could start over clean." "Tell me about my real papa," Robin said, and there was no accusation in her voice, just a child's need to understand. "Tell me who you were before Frank Morrison." Frank looked at his daughter for a long moment, then at Cornelius, perhaps seeing in the older man's face the judgment he expected. But Cornelius remained silent, remembering his own failures, his own moments of choosing the easy path over the right one. "My name is William Fletcher," Frank said quietly. "I was a school teacher in Missouri before the war. I taught children how to read and write and figure numbers." His voice grew softer. "I met your mama at a church social. She was the prettiest girl I'd ever seen, and she laughed at all my terrible jokes." "What happened?" Robin asked. "The war happened. I went off to fight, and when I came back, everything was different. The school was burned down, most of the town was gone, and I couldn't find work anywhere. People said I was shell-shocked, said I wasn't fit to be around children anymore." William's voice took on the flat tone of someone reciting a painful history. "We had you by then, and another baby on the way, but the baby—" He stopped, unable to continue. "We lost a baby." Robin asked in a small voice. "Your little brother," William said. "He was born too early, and we didn't have money for a doctor. That's when I started thinking that the rules didn't apply to people like us anymore. People who'd lost everything to a war that nobody really won." Cornelius found himself thinking of his own losses, his own moments when grief had made him want to strike out at a world that seemed indifferent to suffering. He'd chosen isolation instead of crime, but he understood the anger that could drive a good man to make terrible choices. "The first time was supposed to be the only time," William continued. "Just enough money to get us back on our feet. But it's like drinking. Once you start, it gets easier each time until you don't remember who you used to be." "But you were still my papa," Robin said firmly. "You still sang songs and told stories and made my doll." "I tried to keep William Fletcher alive for you," he said, tears streaming down his face. "Every night around the campfire, every story I told, every time I carved you a toy, that was me trying to remember who I used to be." As if summoned by the sound of her husband's voice, Mary Ellen stirred across the clearing. Her eyes opened, unfocused but aware, and she tried to speak. "Will," she whispered, the name carrying 15 years of shared secrets and compromises. "I'm here, Mary," William called back, his voice breaking. "I'm here, and Robin's safe." But Mary Ellen's brief moment of consciousness revealed the cruel truth they'd all been avoiding. Even from a distance, Cornelius could see that she was badly hurt, her breathing shallow and labored. She was dying, and they all knew it. "Robin," she whispered, and with tremendous effort she managed to remove something from around her neck. "Come here, baby." "I can't, Mama," Robin said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm trapped." Mary Ellen looked toward her husband with eyes that held a lifetime of love and forgiveness. "Take care of our girl," she said. And those were the last words she ever spoke. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind through the pine trees and Robin's quiet sobbing. William Fletcher, the man who'd become Frank Morrison to protect his family, stared at his wife's still form with the devastation of someone watching. "His world end. She never wanted this life," he said finally. "She stayed with me because she loved me, but she hated what I'd become." Cornelius knew he was witnessing a man's complete collapse, the final breaking of someone who'd been held together by hope and desperation. But they couldn't afford such luxury now, not with Robin's life hanging in the balance. "William," he said firmly, using the man's real name deliberately. Your daughter needs you to be her father right now, not Frank Morrison. Can you do that? William looked up, focusing on Cornelius with effort. What do you mean? I mean, it's time to make things right. I'm dying. This infection is going to kill me before another day passes. But you and Robin still have a chance. My leg's broken. I can barely move. Then we'll find another way, Cornelius said, and slowly, painfully, he began to work the wedding ring off his finger. The gold band had been there so long it had worn a groove in his flesh, but after several minutes of careful manipulation, it came free. What are you doing? Robin asked. Making a trade, Cornelius said, holding up the ring. This is the last thing I have of my old life, and it's time to let it go. He looked at William, with eyes that held no judgment, only determination. We're going to get your daughter out of here, even if it kills us both. As the sun climbed higher and the snow began to melt around the edges of their shelter, 3 people who'd lost everything began planning for a future that would cost them even more. The makeshift cross that Cornelius carved from a piece of wagon wood was simple but respectful. 2 pieces of oak lashed together with leather strips, the kind of marker that would weather the mountain seasons and stand as testimony to a woman who'd tried to love a good man through his worst choices. He'd used his bone knife despite his failing strength, each cut deliberate and clean, creating something worthy of Mary Ellen Fletcher's memory. She should have words on it, Robin said quietly, as they prepared to lay her mother to rest. Mama loved words. She used to read to me from the Bible every night. William Fletcher, propped against a fallen tree with his broken legs splintered as best they could manage, watched his wife's burial with the hollow eyes of a man who'd lost his anchor in the world. She was Mary Ellen Hartwell before she married me, he said, daughter of a preacher, smartest woman in 3 counties. She deserved better than Frank Morrison's life. Cornelius planted the cross at the head of the shallow grave they'd managed to dig despite their injuries. The work had cost him dearly. His infected hand was now useless, black with gangrene that was spreading toward his wrist. But some things were more important than personal comfort, and giving Mary Ellen Fletcher a proper farewell was one of them. She got William Fletcher's love, Cornelius said firmly. That counts for something. With Mary Ellen laid to rest, they turned their attention to the desperate mathematics of survival. Cornelius knew he was dying. The infection had progressed too far to reverse, and his time was measured in hours rather than days. William's injuries were severe, but not immediately fatal. Robin was trapped but otherwise healthy. The equation was brutal but clear. One of them might live if the other 2 were willing to sacrifice everything. The log has settled deeper into the ground, Cornelius observed, examining their prison with the methodical attention of a craftsman solving a complex problem. But the weight distribution has changed too. If we can create enough lift at the right point, we might get enough clearance. William studied the massive pine with the calculating eye of a man who'd spent years planning difficult jobs under pressure. We'd need leverage and a fulcrum point that can handle the stress. That boulder there, it's solid enough, but we need something longer and stronger than anything we've tried before. The wagon tongue broke last time. Robin pointed out with the practical wisdom of someone who'd watched their previous attempts fail. Maybe we need something different. Cornelius had been thinking the same thing. His eyes fell on the wagon's rear axle, a piece of seasoned hickory designed to bear the weight of a fully loaded wagon over hundreds of miles of rough terrain. It was massive, nearly 8 feet long and thick as a man's arm, but if they could position it correctly, it might provide the leverage they needed. Help me get that axle free, he told William, pointing to the rear of the overturned wagon. Working together despite their injuries, they managed to separate the axle from the wagon body. The hickory was even heavier than it looked, and moving it into position required every ounce of strength they could muster between them. Cornelius's vision kept blurring from pain and blood loss, but he forced himself to focus on the physics of the problem. The fulcrum point needs to be exactly here, he said, marking a spot on the boulder with a piece of charcoal from their fire. Too far forward, and we won't get enough lift. Too far back, and the axle will snap under the pressure. They wedged one end of the axle beneath the log as close to Robin as they dared, then positioned the fulcrum point with mathematical precision. The setup looked promising, but Cornelius knew it would require both men's combined weight to generate enough force. And in his condition, he wasn't sure he could contribute much. When we make our attempt, Robin, you need to be ready to move the instant you feel that log shift, William told his daughter. Don't wait to see if it's enough clearance. Just get yourself free as fast as you can. Robin nodded, her face set with determination that reminded Cornelius of his own children's courage in the face of hardship. I'm ready, Papa. But before they could begin their attempt, a sound from the forest stopped them all cold. The distant whinny of horses and the jingle of tack that meant riders were approaching. In the clear mountain air, sounds carried far, but these were close enough to suggest that whoever was coming would reach the clearing within minutes. William's face went pale. Law or bounty hunters, he said grimly. Either way, they're not coming to help. Cornelius felt his heart hammering against his ribs, though whether from fear or his failing condition, he couldn't tell. How many? Sounds like at least 3 horses, maybe more. William reached for the pistol at his belt, then stopped, looking at Robin. I can't. Not in front of her. Papa, what's happening? Robin asked, sensing the sudden tension. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and through the trees they could see movement. Dark shapes moving with the purposeful advance of men who knew exactly what they were looking for. These weren't casual travelers who might help stranded families. These were hunters, and Frank Morrison was their prey. Robin, Cornelius said urgently, when I give the word, you close your eyes and cover your ears. Don't look up no matter what you hear. Can you do that for me? She nodded, though her eyes were wide with fear she was trying to hide. The riders broke through the tree line into the clearing, and Cornelius's worst fears were confirmed. 3 men, hard-faced and heavily armed, with the look of professionals who'd spent years tracking dangerous quarry. Their leader, a tall man with cold eyes and a badge pinned to his coat, surveyed the scene with the satisfaction of someone whose patience had finally paid off. Frank Morrison, the man called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I'm Deputy Marshal James Crawford, and you're under arrest for bank robbery, murder, and a dozen other charges that'll see you hang. William Fletcher straightened as much as his injuries would allow, and for a moment, some trace of the schoolteacher he'd once been showed through Frank Morrison's desperate facade. My daughter's hurt, he said simply. Whatever happens to me, she needs help. Crawford's gaze shifted to Robin, trapped beneath the log, then to Cornelius. Old man, you picked the wrong people to help. Frank Morrison's killed lawmen and civilians alike. You'd have been better off leaving them to die. Maybe, Cornelius said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice, despite everything. But I've never been good at walking away from children who need help. The marshal's eyes narrowed as he took in Cornelius's condition. The infected hand. The obvious weakness, the pallor of approaching death. You're dying anyway, aren't you? Infection. Yes. Then this doesn't have to concern you. We're here for Morrison and whatever money he's got hidden in that wagon. The girl? Crawford paused, studying Robin with calculating eyes. Well, we'll figure something out for the girl. Something in the marshal's tone made Cornelius's blood run cold. These men weren't here to rescue anyone or see justice done. They were here for the bounty on Frank Morrison's head and whatever stolen money they could recover. Robin was just an inconvenience to be dealt with once her father was dead. Deputy Marshal James Crawford's badge caught the afternoon sunlight as he surveyed the scene with cold satisfaction. The star-shaped piece of tin that should have represented justice looked more like a predator's mark in the way he wore it. Behind him, his 2 remaining men flanked the clearing with their hands on their weapons. Professional killers masquerading as lawmen. Frank Morrison, Crawford called out, his voice carrying the false authority of corruption wrapped in a badge. $500. Says you're worth more dead than alive. And I'm inclined to collect. William Fletcher, propped against a fallen tree with his broken leg, looked at his daughter still trapped beneath the massive log. Blood had crusted in his hair from the wagon crash, and one arm hung at an unnatural angle. But his eyes were clear and focused on protecting Robin with whatever time he had left. "The money's all in the wagon," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the pain. "Take it and leave the child be." "Oh, we'll take the money," Crawford assured him with mock politeness. "But there's still the matter of loose ends." "Can't have witnesses running around telling tales about how we conduct business." Cornelius felt a cold rage building in his chest. Not the hot fury of a young man, but the calculated anger of someone who'd seen too much injustice in the world. These weren't lawmen seeking justice. They were scavengers feeding on human misery, wearing badges as camouflage for their crimes. "The girl's innocent," Cornelius said, his voice carrying what authority a dying man could muster. "She's just a child who's lost her mother and watched her world fall apart." Crawford's laugh held no warmth, only the cruel amusement of a predator toying with its prey. "She's Frank Morrison's blood. That makes her guilty enough for our purposes. Besides, dead children don't grow up to seek revenge." One of Crawford's men had found the hidden compartment in the wagon, whistling appreciatively as he counted stacks of bills with practiced fingers. "Enough here to set us up proper, James. More than we've seen in years of this badge work." "Good," Crawford said, drawing his revolver with practiced ease. "Now then, Frank, about that bounty on your head." William Fletcher moved with the desperate courage that only a father protecting his child could summon. Despite his broken leg and injured arm, he lunged for the pistol that had fallen near where they'd buried his wife. He was too hurt to be fast, too desperate to be accurate. But his movement triggered the violence that had been building like a thunderstorm. Crawford's shot echoed off the mountain walls like thunder splitting the sky. The bullet caught William in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground beside his wife's grave. But even as he fell, he'd managed to get his own weapon clear, and his return shot took one of Crawford's men in the shoulder, sending the killer stumbling backward with a curse. "Papa!" Robin screamed, straining against the log that still held her trapped, her small hands clawing at the earth as she tried to reach her dying father. The gunfight that followed was brief but savage, conducted with the desperate intensity of men who knew only one of them would walk away from this clearing. William, despite his mortal wound, fought with the protective fury of a father defending his child. Crawford's men had the advantages of mobility and numbers, but they'd underestimated the determination of a cornered schoolteacher who'd learned to kill during the war and would do anything to protect his daughter. The wounded man tried to flank around the overturned wagon, but walked into William's second shot, which dropped him permanently to the forest floor. The third man, seeing his companions fall, broke and ran for the trees, more interested in preserving his own life than collecting any bounty. When the shooting stopped, Crawford stood alone over William's still form, smoke rising from his revolver barrel like incense at a funeral. The corrupt marshal's badge had been knocked askew during the fight, hanging crookedly on his coat like a broken promise. "Stubborn to the end," Crawford muttered, nudging the body with his boot. "Should have made this easy, Frank. Could have been quick and clean." But William Fletcher wasn't quite dead yet. His eyes fluttered open one last time, focusing on his daughter with the clarity that sometimes comes to the dying. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Robin," he whispered, love filling every syllable. "Be brave, little bird. Remember what I taught you about the compass. Remember that love is the only thing that lasts." "Don't worry about her," Crawford said with mock sympathy, turning his attention to the trapped girl. "She won't be anyone's problem much longer." That's when Cornelius made his choice. 15 years of isolation and self-protection fell away like morning mist as he looked at Robin, terrified, trapped, watching her father die while a killer prepared to murder her too. All his careful walls, all his reasons for avoiding human connection, suddenly seemed like the coward's refuge they'd always been. This child needed him, and that need called forth something in his soul that he'd thought was buried forever. With his one good hand, Cornelius grabbed the hickory axle they'd positioned as a lever earlier. Every ounce of strength left in his failing body went into that desperate push against the fulcrum, using physics and determination to create the lift they needed to free Robin from her wooden prison. Now, Robin, move! He shouted, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. The massive log shifted, not much, but enough. 6 precious inches of clearance that Robin used with childhood's quick reflexes, rolling clear of the crushing weight that had held her captive for 4 endless days. She scrambled to her feet, miraculous and free, dirt and bark falling from her torn dress as she stood upright for the first time since the accident. Crawford spun toward her, his gun tracking her movement with predatory precision. "Well now," the corrupt marshal said, raising his weapon with deliberate slowness. "Looks like the little bird wants to fly. Let's clip those wings permanent." But Robin wasn't running. Instead, she dropped to her knees beside her dying father, taking his bloody hand in both of hers with the fearless love that only children possess. Tears streamed down her dirty cheeks, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "I'm here, Papa. I'm free. And I'm here with you." William Fletcher smiled then, genuine joy lighting his face despite the pain that was stealing his life away. "My brave girl," he whispered. "You're the best thing I ever did in this world. Don't let anyone tell you different." Crawford aimed carefully at Robin's small back, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Time to join your papa, little girl." But Cornelius had one more move left in his failing body, using both hands, his good one and his ruined one. He lifted the heavy hickory axle and hurled it with every bit of strength remaining in his dying frame. The seasoned timber, as thick as a man's arm and hard as iron, flew true and straight, catching Crawford behind the knees like a scythe cutting wheat. The corrupt marshal went down hard, his shot going wild into the trees as he crashed face first into the rocky ground. His badge flew off his coat and landed in the dirt near William's body, the tin star looking small and worthless without the false authority it had carried. The effort cost Cornelius everything he had left, and more. His vision grayed at the edges, then darkened completely as infection and blood loss finally claimed their due. He collapsed beside the log that had been their shared prison, his hand falling across the rough bark that had held them captive and ultimately brought them together. Through the gathering darkness of approaching death, he heard the sound that meant salvation, the thunder of approaching hooves as real lawmen. Drawn by the gunshots and reports of Crawford's unauthorized manhunt, finally arrived to set things right. Sheriff Patterson's voice cut through the clearing like a blessing. "Dear God in heaven, what happened here?" As consciousness faded, Cornelius felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years, the profound peace that comes from loving someone more than yourself, from spending your life for something worth dying for. He'd saved Robin, and in saving her, he'd found his own redemption. The last thing he heard was her voice, small but determined, telling the sheriff about the brave mountain man who'd given everything to keep her safe. And somehow, that was the finest eulogy Cornelius Ashford could have asked for. 6 months later, spring had returned to the Montana high country with its promise of renewal and second chances. The snow had melted from all but the highest peaks, revealing a world washed clean and ready to begin again. In the small town of Cedar Falls, the same community Cornelius had fled 15 years earlier, 2 figures walked slowly along the main street, their steps unhurried and comfortable. Cornelius Ashford moved with the careful gait of a man who'd nearly died and been granted an unexpected reprieve. His right hand remained partially crippled from the infection, fingers stiff and scarred, but functional enough for the work that now gave his days meaning. Beside him, Robin Fletcher walked with the easy confidence of a child who'd found her place in the world after losing everything she'd once known. "Tell me again about the day Sheriff Patterson found us," Robin said, though she'd heard the story dozens of times. Some memories needed regular polishing to keep them bright. "Well," Cornelius said, with the patient voice of a man who'd learned to treasure such requests, "I thought I was dying, and I probably should have been. But when those horses we heard turned out to be Sheriff Patterson and his deputies instead of more bounty hunters, everything changed. The real sheriff, unlike the corrupt Crawford, had arrived at the clearing just as the gunfight ended, drawn by reports of Crawford's unauthorized manhunt and the suspicion that the deputy marshal had gone rogue. What he'd found was a scene of carnage that told its own story. A dying outlaw who'd fought to protect his child, a corrupt lawman who'd cared more about bounty money than justice, and an old hermit who'd sacrificed himself to save an innocent girl. Sheriff Patterson said, "You were the stubbornest patient Doc Henderson ever treated," Robin continued with a grin. "Said you kept trying to get out of bed to check on me while you were still delirious with fever." Cornelius smiled at the memory. The town doctor had indeed called him stubborn, along with several other colorful descriptions during the weeks of treatment that had slowly pulled him back from death's door. The infection had cost him the full use of his hand, but it hadn't cost him his life, or more importantly, his chance to see Robin safe and settled. They paused in front of a small white church, where a sign announced, "Pastor Marcus Whitfield, Sunday service 10 a.m., all welcome." This was where Robin had found her new home, with the pastor and his wife, who'd opened their hearts to an orphaned child with nowhere else to go. "Mrs. Whitfield says I can help with the church picnic next month," Robin said, her voice bright with anticipation. "She's teaching me to make her special apple pies. I'd like to try one of those pies," Cornelius said, though privately he marveled at how easily Robin had adapted to her new life. The resilience of childhood never ceased to amaze him, the way young hearts could heal even the deepest wounds, given enough love and security. From his pocket, Cornelius pulled out a small wooden cross, newly carved and polished to a warm glow. Unlike the rough marker they'd made for Robin's mother, this one was crafted with all the skill and patience that 15 years of solitude had taught him. Every curve was perfect, every surface smooth as silk. "For me?" Robin asked, though she already knew the answer. "A promise," Cornelius said, as he slipped the leather cord around her neck. "No matter where life takes you, no matter how far you travel, you'll always have family who loves you." Robin touched the cross gently, then reached up to hug the old man who'd become the grandfather she'd never known she needed. "And you'll always have someone who needs your stories. And your wisdom," she said with the solemnity that still surfaced when she spoke of important things. The arrangement they'd worked out suited them both perfectly. Cornelius had returned to the mountains, but not as a hermit. His cabin now served as a base for the work that had given his life new purpose, teaching survival skills to young people, guiding hunting parties through the wilderness, sharing the hard-won knowledge that had kept him alive for decades in the high country. But every weekend, he came down to Cedar Falls to spend time with Robin, taking her on carefully planned expeditions to teach her the ways of the wilderness, listening to her stories of school and friends and the 1,000 small adventures that filled a child's life. "Mr. Cornelius," Robin said as they continued their walk, "do you think Papa and Mama would be proud of how we turned out?" It was a question she asked periodically, usually when she was processing some new understanding about her parents' complex legacy. William Fletcher, the school teacher, and Frank Morrison, the outlaw, had been the same man, capable of both great love and terrible choices, and Robin was still learning to reconcile those contradictions. "I think," Cornelius said carefully, "that they'd be proud to see how brave and kind you've become, despite everything you've been through. And I think they'd understand that sometimes the best way to honor people we've lost is to build something better from what they left behind." As evening approached and it came time for Cornelius to return to his mountain cabin, they performed their weekly ritual of parting. Robin would hug him tight and make him promise to be careful on the trail home. He would remind her to mind Pastor and Mrs. Whitfield and keep up with her studies. They would both pretend that a week was no time at all, though they both felt every day of separation. "Next weekend, will you tell me the story about the time you saw the great grizzly bear?" Robin asked as Cornelius prepared to mount his horse, not Jasper, who had finally succumbed to old age the previous winter, but a younger mule named Copper, who was proving just as reliable and twice as stubborn. "I'll tell you any story you want to hear," Cornelius promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. as he rode out of town toward the mountains that had been both his refuge and his prison. Cornelius reflected on the strange turns life could take. He'd spent 15 years running from love because it had once brought him unbearable pain, only to discover that love itself wasn't the enemy. The enemy was the fear that kept him from embracing it again. Robin waved from the church steps until he was out of sight, then went inside to help Mrs. Whitfield with the evening meal. She still carried her father's compass in her pocket and her mother's locket around her neck. But now they were joined by Cornelius's wooden cross, symbols not just of loss, but of the enduring connections that make life worth living. In the high country, as stars began to appear in the darkening sky, an old mountain man made his solitary camp with a heart fuller than it had been in decades. He was no longer alone, would never truly be alone again, because somewhere down in the valley, a little girl was saying her prayers and including him in her hopes for tomorrow. Love, it turned out, was the one thing that grew stronger when you gave it away. And both Cornelius and Robin had learned that sometimes the most important journeys begin not when you set out to find something new, but when you finally stop running from what you've been carrying in your heart all along. The mountains held their silence, but it was no longer the silence of isolation. It was the silence of peace, of a man who'd found his way home by helping someone else find theirs.